My name is Emily, though I chose it on a bus, somewhere between the fields and the city lights. The name I was born with is still back there, hanging in the air of the prayer hall, under the yellow bulbs that never flickered. I left the community at 29, and the first thing I heard was not freedom, it was silence. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that hums between your temples when someone turns off the only radio you've ever known. On the cracked vinyl seat of the Greyhound, I sat upright, as if confessing, clutching a thrift store backpack and catching the faint reflection of a woman whose eyes no longer shone. In my pocket was the cardboard tag from a cheap motel key in Tulsa. The corners scratched my fingers, reminding me that you can breathe in a room without bars and still feel caged. Freedom was narrow. 2 strips of stained carpet, a soda machine humming like a restless animal, a shower with a slick floor. I told myself, you won't go back, but the voice wasn't mine. It belonged to the people who had trained us to believe a woman's body was a vessel for someone else's will. I knew this much. If I stayed silent now, the road home would appear from anywhere, because she moves faster than buses and knows every shortcut. The story is not about miracles, and it isn't about truth pulled like a flag from a secret pocket. It's about learning to hear the sound of your own footsteps and not mistake them for the drumbeat of someone's sermon. If you're listening in the dark kitchen, long after the kids are asleep, with the fridge muttering in the background, know this: it won't be a pretty road, but it's real, and I have to tell it all, or I'll fall asleep again in a voice that isn't mine. And I should tell you now, I didn't save anyone but myself, and even that took time. Months passed before I could admit what doesn't survive sunlight, that I still prefer enclosed spaces, that I look away when I pass churches, and that forgiveness, even when stamped official, feels cold when there's still a warden living inside you.
The room at the Route 66 Inn smelled faintly of mildew, cleaner, and the kind of cinnamon they sprinkle on everything in this country to hide the fact that someone else has been there before you. I took off my shoes and waited for the buzzing by the thin door to stop. At the front desk, they were weighing plastic bags for late-night guests. In the community, they told us the world was a carnival of temptations, and you had to look down on its noise, like flies over spoiled meat. I always nodded, but now I was lying on a stiff bed, listening to the ice machine breathing like a giant fish, and trying to figure out what I wanted, if all the must-nots were gone. Did I want milk? Music? Did I even have a favorite number? I didn't know. At dawn, I walked to the 24-hour Walmart. It was too bright inside, the floor shining like a platform after the train has long gone. I froze in front of the yogurt aisle. Brands, dates, flavors, strawberry, vanilla, peach, tiramisu. Each cup shouted, "Choose me," and the sound felt like a choir I'd been taught to turn away from. A woman in a Sooners t-shirt asked if I was okay. I wanted to answer, but my tongue stuck. If I picked vanilla, was that me? If strawberry, was I betraying something in my past? I stood so long the security guard passed by 3 times, smiling that polite law enforcement smile. Finally, I grabbed plain, no flavor, no promises, and realized it was the first decision I'd made all day. At the register, I added a toothbrush and batteries for a clock, because if you start your own time, maybe it moves differently. Outside smelled of gasoline and wet cardboard. I ate yogurt with the plastic spoon beside the carts, repeating, "Plain is a flavor too." It became my new arithmetic, not right and wrong, but bearable and survivable, until the metronome inside could learn a rhythm of its own.
Finding work didn't happen overnight. On the corkboard at the bus terminal, paper strips dangled from flyers, cleaning shifts, warehouse nights, a spot at the Waffle House. I chose the Waffle House, not for the waffles, but for the endless coffee. Anything endless felt safe. The manager, a sturdy woman named Dolly, asked if I had experience. I said domestic, and she nodded. Everyone here had a kind of experience you couldn't put on a resume. My first day, I learned to stand in the noise without falling, forks clinking, cash registers beeping, country songs about men in trucks drifting through the air. My hands moved on autopilot, pour, wipe, smile, and there was relief in that. But shame sat low in my stomach. When a man in camouflage said, "Hey, pretty," I flinched, suddenly 14 again, back when an older woman adjusted my skirt with sharp fingers. On break, I stood by the dumpsters until the smell of frying oil replaced everything else. Inside, something was loosening, like a piece of furniture slowly being taken apart. You see the screw turning. You're afraid that it'll collapse, but you keep turning anyway because it's honest work. At night, I returned to my motel and listened to neighbors argue about baseball. In the community, there was no baseball, just rules. Now I was learning rules that weren't printed on a wall. How to refuse a customer who asked for my number, how to smile without giving away a piece of myself, how to say no and not brace for punishment. Sometimes I pictured standing in church, the pastor saying, "You are forgiven," and me answering, "Don't bother." That image scared me. How easily it came, how natural my no felt. Then one afternoon, a man left a tip, $5 folded in a square, with a note on a napkin. "Thanks for noticing I was tired." I took the napkin and knew I'd made another choice, to see someone's exhaustion without dissolving into it. Freedom, I realized, started in places too small for doors.
If I trace it back, the mornings were all the same. 5:45, the bell, bare feet on cold linoleum, and a prayer recited like brushing your teeth. Not conversation, but hygiene. We were taught that every thought was dirt under the nails, to be scrubbed until it hurt, so the soul would shine. We sang hymns with a single droning note, as long as the hallway to the dining room. Sometimes I'd glance up and see dust turning in a beam of light, moving freely, and it scared me more than any sermon. My mother said freedom wasn't a right, it was a test most people failed, because the heart was deceitful. The heart, she said, was like a rusty faucet. Leave it running, and it would flood the whole house. We didn't study biology in school, but we memorized verses about obedience. The first time someone touched me rougher than allowed, my thought wasn't stop. It was, I must have caused this. Shame sewed me a new collar I couldn't take off, even in the heat. I grew like a plant in a pot too small, never knowing pain was a signal, not a sentence. Then came the volunteers after the tornado tore through town. Boxes of food, bottled water, and one woman who pressed a folded paper into my hand and whispered, "If you ever need it, call." I slid the number under my insole and walked on it for 2 years, feeling it wear thin against my fate. The tornado passed, roofs got patched, but a draft settled in my chest. I started hearing the walls whisper, "Stay." Whispers don't crush, they haunt. And one night, after the pastor said God loved the obedient, I thought, for the first time, that love you have to earn is just a contract. That night, I slipped the storage room key into my pocket and walked toward the road. On Wednesdays at noon, the town tested the tornado sirens. We'd all stop and listen to the air howl. I used to dream of hearing a different signal, steady, like a highway, leading my way. When I finally heard it, it wasn't a sound at all. It was a click in my head, a small yes only I could hear.
The yes carried me farther than I expected. I didn't run. I walked, steady, as if I were on an errand no one could question. The highway shoulder crunched under my sneakers, and the moon hung low, almost the same pale orange as the streetlights back home. By dawn, I'd reached the edge of Tulsa. A diner with fogged windows glowed in the distance, and I stepped inside like I'd crossed a border. The waitress barely looked up as she poured me coffee. No one here knew the rules I'd broken just to sit at that counter. The anonymity was a kind of warmth I'd never felt. I had $84 in my pocket, and the folded motel receipt Dolly from the diner later called a starter home. I found the Route 66 Inn by following a flickering neon arrow. The man at the front desk didn't ask for references, just cash. My room smelled of bleach and old air conditioning, but the lock on the door turned from the inside, and that was a novelty. I slept through most of the first day, the kind of sleep that isn't rest, but escape. The second morning, I woke to a silence so wide it made me dizzy. In the community, silence was filled with scripture. Here, it was empty, waiting for me to fill it. I realized I didn't know how. I made a list in the motel notepad: toothbrush, socks, bus schedule, job board. Beneath it, I wrote in smaller letters, "Find something to want." The paper tore under the pen's pressure. I kept my shoes by the bed, just in case someone came knocking to take me back. Every time a car slowed outside, my body braced. That fear was the warden I'd carried with me, the one who didn't need bars or locks to keep me in line. Still, the click in my head hadn't faded. It was there under the hum of the air conditioner, telling me that I had already crossed the first line and that going back was still possible, but no longer inevitable.
The job board at the bus terminal was a collage of desperation and possibility. Handwritten numbers on tear-off tabs, bold black ink for immediate hire, faded flyers curling at the edges. I stood there longer than I meant to, reading each one like it might contain a secret code. Dishwasher, janitorial night shift, waitstaff for a Waffle House on the east side. I took the tab for the Waffle House, not because I cared about waffles, but because they promised endless coffee. Endless meant I could sit still without anyone asking why. The manager's name was Dolly, a woman with tired eyes and the kind of voice that could cut through a storm. Experience? She asked. Domestic, I said, and she didn't press for details. My first shift felt like stepping onto a stage with no rehearsal. Orders shouted, plates sliding, country music twanging about love and loss. My hands moved on instinct, wipe the counter, refill the mug, keep moving. But my chest felt tight, as if each interaction were a test I hadn't studied for. When a man in camouflage called me sweetheart, my shoulders locked. I was back in the community kitchen at 14, someone's hand correcting the way I stirred a pot, the unspoken warning in their grip. During my break, I slipped outside to the dumpsters, letting the smell of old grease overwhelm everything else. I thought of the number still hidden under my motel mattress, the last safety net I hadn't used. That night, back in my room, I replayed the shift in my head. No one had punished me for refusing the man's offer to show me around town. No one had even noticed. The next morning, Dolly handed me my schedule and said, "You'll get used to it." I wasn't sure if she meant the noise, the pace, or the freedom to say no without consequence. Maybe all of it. I folded the paper and felt, for a second, that the warden in my head had stepped a little farther from the bars. Small victories came disguised as nothing at all. A cup refilled before a customer had to ask. A plate balanced just right so the eggs didn't slide into the toast. The first time I caught my reflection in the chrome of the coffee machine and didn't look away. Dolly noticed things without making a show of it. She'd slide an extra biscuit onto my plate during breaks or step in when a customer's voice sharpened. "She's busy," Dolly would say, and it felt like someone had quietly built a fence around me. One afternoon, a man in a frayed baseball cap left a $5 bill folded into a perfect square. On the napkin beside it, in careful black letters, he'd written, "Thanks for noticing I was tired." I stared at those words longer than I should have. In the community, noticing someone's struggle was a call to pray it away, to scrub it clean with scripture until nothing human remained. Here it was just acknowledgement. No sermon, no agenda. I slipped the napkin into my apron pocket, and for the rest of the shift, I carried it like a talisman. That night in my motel room, I unfolded it again, tracing the letters with my thumb. It struck me that I'd made a choice in that moment at his table. I'd seen his exhaustion and let it exist without trying to fix it or take it as my own. Maybe that was what freedom actually looked like.
not the absence of rules, but the right to decide what you let in. The warden in my head didn't like it. He reminded me that compassion was dangerous, that caring without obedience was rebellion. But I fell asleep with a napkin under my pillow, and for once, his voice sounded farther away, as if muffled by the hum of the motel's ancient air conditioner.
I used to think childhood was a blank space before life began, but mine felt more like a script someone else had written in thick black marker. Mornings were the same. The bell at 5:45, bare feet on the cold linoleum, a prayer that rolled off my tongue like the taste of toothpaste, habit, not meaning. We were told thoughts were dangerous, tiny weeds that could crack the foundation if left alone. So we clipped them, one by one, before they had a chance to bloom. Hymns had only one note, stretched long and thin like the hallway to the dining room. Sometimes I'd see dust turning in a beam of sunlight and wonder how it could move so freely without being punished. My mother warned that freedom was a test most failed because the heart was like a rusty faucet. Leave it running and it will flood the whole house. We never studied biology, but we could recite verses on obedience without hesitation. The first time someone touched me with more force than kindness, my mind didn't shout stop. It whispered, "You must have caused this." Shame became a collar I wore year-round, heavy even in summer. When the tornado hit, volunteers brought boxes of canned food and bottled water. One woman pressed a folded slip of paper into my hand and murmured, "If you ever need it, call." I slid it under the insole of my shoe, carried it for 2 years, feeling it wear thin with every step. The storm passed, houses were patched, but inside me, a draft remained. I started hearing the walls whisper, "Stay," soft but constant. One night, after the pastor preached that God loved the obedient, I realized love that has to be earned is just a contract. That was the night I pocketed the storage room key. I didn't hear sirens or alarms, just a quiet click inside my skull. The smallest yes I'd ever allowed myself, but the one that carried me all the way to the highway.
The road out didn't feel like escape. It felt like trespassing. Every step away from the community was a step deeper into someone else's world, one I wasn't sure I had permission to enter. The key in my pocket was warm from my palm, the metal edges digging into my skin as if reminding me there was no going back without admitting I'd left. I walked along the shoulder until the sun began to rise, my shadow stretching ahead like it was leading the way. Trucks roared past, carrying hay bales and construction equipment. Drivers too busy to notice me. That invisibility was both a relief and a sting. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be seen or not. By mid-morning, my feet ached, and I found myself in a town just big enough to have a gas station and a diner with peeling red paint. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and fried onions. The waitress poured without asking, her bracelets clinking against the pot. I sipped slowly, feeling the heat work its way into my chest. No one asked where I'd come from, and no one offered to take me back. It was the first time in years I'd sat at a table without an assigned seat. After breakfast, I followed the road into Tulsa. The neon sign of the Route 66 Inn buzzed in the distance, half the letters burned out, the arrow flickering like it couldn't decide which way to point. The man at the desk handed me a room key in exchange for cash and didn't even ask my name. In the community, that kind of anonymity was a threat. They told us only the guilty hid themselves. Here, it felt like safety. In the stillness of the room, I realized I had no plan. My entire life had been dictated by someone else's timetable. Now there was only the hum of the air conditioner and the question I'd been avoiding. What do you do when no one is telling you what comes next?
I started with the smallest things, because small was all I could manage. A toothbrush from the corner store, a pair of socks without holes, a bus schedule, though I had nowhere to go yet. I wrote each one on a motel notepad, the paper thin enough to tear under my pen.
At the bottom, almost like an afterthought, I added, "Find something to want." That line stared back at me harder than all the others. Wanting was dangerous where I came from. Desire was a seed that could grow into defiance, and defiance was the first step toward ruin. But here, no one was watching. The motel TV played game shows to an empty room while I sat cross-legged on the bed, trying to remember the last time I'd chosen something for no reason but my own. I couldn't. The second morning, I walked to the bus terminal and stared at the job board. The paper tabs curled with humidity, phone numbers scribbled in hurried ink. I took one for the Waffle House, folded it neatly, and slid it into my pocket like a secret. On the way back, I passed a small church with its doors open. The smell of wood polish and old hymnals drifted out, and for a second my legs wanted to carry me inside. Not out of faith, out of habit. I kept walking, feeling the invisible pull like a leash at my collarbone. Back at the motel, I shut the curtains against the afternoon light. The lock clicked under my hand, and I realized I'd turned it from the inside without thinking. That simple act felt heavier than it should have. I still kept my shoes by the bed, ready to run if a knock came at the door. Fear was a stubborn tenant. But underneath it, quieter, was the click that had started this whole thing. A steady reminder that even if the road back was always open, I didn't have to take it. The first week at the Waffle House was a blur of steam, grease, and orders shouted over the hiss of the griddle. Dolly showed me how to balance 3 plates on one arm, how to keep my smile warm without letting it open the door too wide. "Some folks think they're buying more than breakfast," she said once, and the way she looked at me told me she'd learned that lesson early. The regulars came in waves, construction crews at 6, nurses just off night shift around 8, and the drifters who wandered in whenever the road grew too long. I learned the rhythm quickly: refill, clear, white, repeat. But every so often, something would jar me out of the pattern. A certain laugh from the corner booth, the smell of wood polish drifting in when the door swung open, the way a man's voice could sharpen on a single word. My body reacted before my mind caught up, shoulders tightening, eyes dropping, hands moving faster. In those moments, the Waffle House wasn't a diner. It was the kitchen back home, where someone always had the right to correct you. On my third shift, a customer reached for my wrist to get my attention. I pulled back without thinking. He laughed, a low, dismissive sound, and I felt the old collar close around my throat. I carried his plate to the table, set it down without a word, and walked to the back. Dolly followed me, handed me a glass of water, and said nothing. That silence was more kindness than any prayer I'd been given. Later that night, lying on my motel bed, I thought about how easy it had been to step back, how no lightning had struck, no voice from the pulpit had thundered. Maybe the rules only worked if you believed they still applied, and maybe, just maybe, I was starting to believe they didn't. By the second week, I could carry on small talk with the regulars without feeling like I was walking across thin ice. I learned their names: Earl, who always asked for extra butter but never ate it; Denise, the nurse who laughed so hard her coffee sloshed over the rim. They started asking me little things in return: how long I'd been in Tulsa, if I liked working nights, whether I had family nearby. I kept my answers short, stitched tight enough that nothing could slip out. Still, the questions lingered in the air after I walked away, like the smell of bacon grease that clung to my uniform. One slow afternoon, Dolly leaned on the counter and told me she'd left home at 17. "Some doors you close and never open again," she said, wiping down the same spot twice. I didn't ask what her door had been. Some silences are better left intact. That night, back in my room, I unfolded the slip of paper with the motel's weekly rate written in blue pen. I could just about cover another week with what I'd earned. The thought made my chest both lighter and heavier. Independence was expensive, but it was also intoxicating. Before bed, I sat on the floor with my back against the door, listening to the hallway. Every footstep made my pulse quicken, but no one knocked.
I realized the fear wasn't of being dragged back, it was of being found before I'd figured out who I was without them. Lying in the dark, I tried to imagine a future without the community's calendar dictating every day. My mind kept drifting to blank pages, and for the first time, that didn't terrify me. It almost felt like possibility.
I marked time by paydays. The envelope Dolly handed me every Friday felt heavier than it was, its weight a reminder that the money inside had come from my own hands. I'd count it twice at the motel desk before sliding the bills across to the clerk for another week's stay. The man barely looked at me. The transaction was quick, impersonal, safe. My room was always the same, bleach in the air, the hum of the old AC, carpet worn flat near the bed. I started to memorize the stains on the ceiling, tracing them like a map when I couldn't sleep. Some nights, the quiet pressed in too close, and I'd flick on the TV just to fill the space. I avoided the news, too many faces looking straight into the camera, asking for my attention. Instead, I watched cooking shows where the steaks were nothing more than a burnt crust or a sauce that didn't thicken. At work, I began to anticipate the regulars' orders before they spoke, sliding their mugs across the counter without a word. The rhythm soothed me. But outside the diner and the motel, I kept my circle small. I walked only to the bus terminal, the grocery store, and back. Part of me feared that if I wandered too far, someone might recognize me, call out my old name, and the spell of anonymity would break. Yet with each passing day, the click in my head grew steadier, like a metronome I could almost keep time with. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was distance. And sometimes that's the first shape freedom takes. One night, after closing, I found myself walking past a row of mailboxes on the edge of the motel property. They were dented, their paint chipped, but the thought lodged in my mind before I could stop it. I could write to my mother. The idea felt reckless, almost as dangerous as leaving in the first place. Back in my room, I tore a sheet from the motel notepad and stared at the blank page until my hands started moving. I didn't write about where I was or what I was doing. Instead, I wrote about the weather, about how the rain here smelled like rust and asphalt instead of dust. I asked if she still made her apple bread in the fall. I didn't mention the storage key or the road or the fact that I had stopped praying. When I finished, I folded the paper into thirds and slid it into an envelope I'd bought at the corner store. I addressed it in my careful, school-taught handwriting. But when it came time to seal it, I froze. My mother had always said the truth would find you, even if you tried to hide it. I wasn't sure which truth she'd see first, the one where I left or the one where I wasn't coming back. I left the envelope on the desk for 3 days, moving it from one side to the other, like it might decide on its own. On the fourth morning, I tucked it into the drawer with my socks and shut it away. I told myself I'd send it later, but deep down I knew. Some letters aren't meant to be mailed. They're just a way to hear your own voice without anyone talking back. It was Dolly who first mentioned the group. We were wiping down the counter after the lunch rush when she said, almost casually, "There's a place you can go if you want to hear people talk who've been through things." She didn't name the things, and I didn't ask. A week later, I found myself sitting in a circle of folding chairs in the back room of a community center. The smell of burnt coffee and lemon cleaner clung to the walls. No one prayed before speaking. No one quoted scripture. People just told their stories, quietly, sometimes haltingly, but without the sharp edges of judgment I'd grown used to. A man with weathered hands talked about 20 years on the road, always one step ahead of his own mistakes. A woman in a floral dress described the first time she'd signed her own lease after leaving her husband. When my turn came, I froze. My throat worked, but no sound came. I shook my head,
And the facilitator just nodded, moving on without making it a spectacle. That alone felt like mercy. I sat there, listening, and realized how rare it was to hear voices that weren't trying to convince me of anything. On the walk back to the motel, I kept replaying the stories in my head, stitching together the similarities between them and my own. We were all carrying something invisible, and in that room, no one tried to make it disappear. That night, I didn't turn on the TV. I lay in the dark, letting the hum of the air conditioner fill the space where the warden's voice usually lived.
The call came on a Tuesday night, just after I'd kicked off my shoes and poured a glass of water. The number was unfamiliar, but something in me knew before I answered. The voice on the other end was syrupy, warm, unmistakably familiar. "Emily," she said, only she used the name I'd left behind. "We've been praying for you." I gripped the phone so tightly my fingers ached. She talked about forgiveness, about how the door was always open, how love could wipe away every wrong. Her words were sweet, but they clung like cobwebs, sticky and hard to shake off. I could almost feel the pull of it, the comfort of knowing exactly what each day would look like, the certainty of rules, the quiet safety of surrender. My chest tightened, and for a moment I pictured myself packing, catching the next bus home, slipping back into my assigned seat like I'd never left. I didn't tell her where I was. I didn't say I was working nights at a diner or that I'd learned to drink coffee without feeling guilty. I let her speak, murmuring little responses, until she finally paused. "We forgive you," she said, as if the words could close the distance between us. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence pressing in on all sides. Forgiveness had been the highest currency back there, the thing we were told to chase. But now it felt hollow, like a gift wrapped around something I no longer wanted. I lay down, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling until the shapes and the stains shifted. Outside, a car door slammed, and for a heartbeat I thought it was someone coming for me. But no one knocked.
The next day, the weight of that phone call followed me like a shadow. By the end of my shift, my chest was tight, my breath shallow. On the bus ride back to the motel, the world felt too loud. The hiss of the doors, the rumble of the engine, the chatter of strangers. My palms were damp, my knees jittering against the seat. Halfway home, the bus pulled into a stop, and I couldn't make myself stay on. I stood up so suddenly, the driver shot me a look, but I mumbled, "Wrong stop," and stepped out into the night air. The street was quiet, lined with darkened storefronts and a single flickering street lamp. My legs carried me to the bench at the far end of the shelter, where I sat gripping the edge as if it might hold me together. I counted my breaths, slow and deliberate, the way I'd seen one of the women in the group do. Gradually, the knot in my chest loosened, but I didn't get back on the bus. I couldn't. The thought of heading straight to the motel felt like walking into a box that might close in on me. So I stayed there, watching buses come and go, their headlights slicing through the dark. I thought about the voice on the phone, about the easy certainty it offered, and about how hard it was to keep choosing the unknown. Eventually, I stood and walked the 2 miles back under a sky heavy with clouds. Each step felt like proof that I hadn't turned around. By the time the motel came into view, the click in my head was faint, but steady, like a stubborn heartbeat.
That night, I didn't go straight inside. Instead, I crossed the street to the bus terminal and sat on one of the cold metal benches inside. The place smelled of burnt coffee and floor cleaner, the kind that seeps into your clothes. A janitor pushed a mop slowly across the tile, his eyes fixed on some point far away. The loudspeaker crackled with departure times for cities I'd never been to: Amarillo, Little Rock, Kansas City. I tried to picture myself boarding one of those buses, starting over somewhere no one knew my name, not even the one I'd chosen. But the thought felt too thin, like tracing paper that would tear under pressure. I closed my eyes and listened to the echo of footsteps in the high-ceilinged room. Freedom isn't the absence of bars, I thought. It's the decision not to walk back through a door that's already open. In the community, the open door was a test, proof that you could be trusted to stay without being locked in. Here, it was a dare. My fingers curled around the edge of the bench, grounding me. I whispered to myself, barely audible over the hum of the vending machines, "You don't have to go back." Saying it out loud felt heavier than thinking it, as if the words themselves carried weight. I stayed until the last bus of the night pulled away, taillights shrinking into the dark. Then I walked back to the motel, the streets empty except for the occasional hiss of a passing car. The lock on my door clicked under my hand, the sound crisp and final. For once, I didn't keep my shoes by the bed.
A week later, I met someone who'd left long before I did. Her name was Marlene, and she came into the Waffle House late one night, ordered black coffee, and sat at the counter like she was too tired to hold herself upright. I noticed the way she scanned the room, not with suspicion, but with the quiet awareness of someone who's learned to keep track of exits. When I set her mug down, she looked at me a moment too long, then said, "You're not from here." It wasn't a question. I felt my stomach tighten, ready for the next words to be an accusation. Instead, she smiled, small and tired. Neither am I. She told me she'd left her group, different name, different rules, 10 years ago. "Took me a while to stop jumping when the phone rang," she said. Her voice was steady, but I could see the ghosts in it. We talked, in small pieces, between refills and orders. She told me which shelters wouldn't ask questions, which temp agencies paid cash, and where to find a laundromat that didn't eat your quarters. "You don't have to figure it all out at once," she said before she left. "Just learn where the safe places are." I wrote her advice on the back of a receipt and tucked it into my wallet. It was the first time since leaving that I felt like I had a map. Not one someone else had drawn for me, but one sketched by a survivor who'd already walked the rough parts of the road. When she pushed open the door and stepped into the night, I realized I was breathing easier than I had in days.
Marlene's words stayed with me, especially the part about not figuring it all out at once. Back in the motel that night, I sat at the desk with a sheet of paper and wrote down every truth I'd avoided saying out loud. I didn't dress them up in scripture or soften them with excuses. I wrote, "I was hurt, and I was told it was my fault. I stayed because I thought I had no choice. I believed leaving would make me unworthy of love." The pen left grooves in the paper, my hand cramping by the time I stopped. Looking at the list made my stomach twist. It felt like I'd broken a rule, even now, alone in a locked room. But there was also a strange relief in seeing it laid bare, no longer tangled in the language I'd been taught. In the community, we were told confession was the path to forgiveness, but this wasn't confession. I wasn't handing my truths to someone else to measure or approve. I was keeping them, owning them. I folded the paper and slid it into my wallet right next to Marlene's notes about safe places. It didn't make me lighter. If anything, it made me feel the weight of my own story more sharply. But maybe that was the point. You can't set down what you've never actually picked up. That night, I lay in bed without the TV on, listening to the muted hum of traffic outside. The warden in my head didn't speak. I wasn't sure if he was gone or just waiting, but for the first time, I didn't care.
In the weeks that followed, I started building small rituals that belonged only to me. Every morning before my shift, I walked 2 laps around the high school track a few blocks from the motel. It was usually empty, the air still cool,
the bleachers casting long shadows across the red rubber lanes. I kept an old AM radio in my pocket, its static-filled music grounding me in the present. After work, I'd stop at the corner store for a single item I wanted. Sometimes fruit, sometimes a magazine, once even a bright blue nail polish I had no intention of wearing. I called it my list of small freedoms, and I kept it taped to the inside of my wallet. Walk when you want. Buy one thing just because. Turn the TV off if you hate what's on. They sound trivial, but each one felt like a quiet rebellion against the life I'd left. At the diner, Dolly noticed the change. "You've got more air in you," she said one slow afternoon, sliding me a plate of fries. I didn't know how to answer, so I just smiled. The truth was, I could feel the click in my head getting steadier, almost in sync with my footsteps on the track each morning. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was stability. And stability, I was learning, could be its own kind of hope. That night as I lay in bed, the thought came to me so suddenly it almost startled me. Maybe I wasn't just surviving anymore. Maybe I was beginning to live. I wrote to my mother again, this time without hesitating. The letter was longer, less careful than the first one I'd never sent. I told her I was safe, that I had a job, that the days felt different now, not better every day, but mine. I didn't apologize for leaving, and I didn't ask for forgiveness. I just described small things, the smell of coffee at the diner, the early morning track walks, the way the Oklahoma sky looked before sunrise. When I sealed the envelope, my hands didn't shake. I mailed it from the post office 2 blocks over, watching it disappear into the blue metal box like dropping a stone into deep water. Weeks passed without a reply. Then one afternoon, the envelope came back. My handwriting on the front, a red stamp in the corner, returned to sender. No explanation. I stood in the parking lot holding it, the paper warm from the sun. For a moment, the old ache rose up, the urge to believe I'd done something unforgivable. But Marlene's words came back to me. Learn where the safe places are. Sometimes that place isn't a person. Sometimes it's a locked motel room, or the back booth at the diner, or the quiet space inside your own head where no one else gets to speak. I slid the unopened envelope into my wallet beside my confession list and went to work. That night, I walked past the mailboxes without looking at them. Forgiveness from the outside would have been nice, but I wasn't holding my breath for it anymore. The season shifted slowly. Warmer mornings, softer light through the blinds, but inside me, something stalled. I started waking later, skipping my laps around the track, letting dishes pile in the motel sink. At the diner, I moved on autopilot, barely tasting the coffee I poured or hearing the order shouted over the grill. The list of small freedoms stayed in my wallet, but I stopped adding to it. Evenings stretched into hours of nothing, the TV flickering while I sat motionless on the bed. It wasn't the sharp pull of wanting to go back. It was a dull weight, the temptation to live quietly without risking anything at all. Safety in stagnation. I told myself I was just tired, that work was wearing me down. But deep down, I knew this was the same trap in a different shape. In the community, they called it waiting on the Lord. Here, it was just waiting for life to happen without moving toward it. One night, I found myself staring at the ceiling stains, tracing the same paths over and over until they blurred. I thought about the number under my mattress, the one I'd never called. It would be so easy, I realized, to slide back into a life where decisions weren't mine to make. But then the click in my head, quiet for days, spoke up again, faint but insistent. You didn't leave to stay still. I turned off the TV and sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the AC, and wondered if maybe moving forward didn't always mean a leap. Sometimes it might just mean standing up. It was Dolly who noticed first.
"You're moving like you've got lead in your shoes," she said one slow afternoon, wiping down the counter while I stacked clean mugs. I shrugged, but she didn't let it go. "Stagnation'll eat you faster than exhaustion." She poured 2 coffees and slid one my way, then leaned her elbows on the counter. "Shame," she said, "is heavier than any sentence I've seen, and I've seen plenty." I didn't answer, but her words sat with me the rest of the day. Shame had been my constant companion for so long it felt like part of my body. In the community, it was hand out like bread, enough to keep you alive, but never enough to fill you. That night, back in my room, I pulled out my list of small freedoms and stared at it until the ink blurred. Walk when you want, buy one thing just because. Turn the TV off if you hate what's on. None of them were impossible, yet I'd let them slide away. I grabbed a pen and added a new line. Do something that makes you feel strange, in a good way. The next morning, I left the motel 15 minutes early and stopped at the thrift store across the street from the diner. I bought a ceramic mug painted with the crooked daisies chipped at the rim. It wasn't practical, it wasn't even my style, but holding it felt like a quiet dare. At work, Dolly noticed it right away. "That yours?" she asked. I nodded, and for the first time in weeks, the click in my head was loud enough to feel like an answer.
A few days later, I found a new room. It was smaller than my motel space, just enough for a bed, a dresser, and a narrow window that looked out over the alley. The landlord didn't ask for references, just first month's rent and cash. The carpet was gone, replaced by scuffed wooden floors that creaked when I walked. It smelled faintly of old books and rain-soaked concrete, and for reasons I couldn't name, that felt right. Moving in took less than an hour. Everything I owned fit into 2 laundry baskets and a backpack. When I shut the door for the first time, the quiet felt different from the motel. It wasn't the emptiness of a place meant for passing through. It was the stillness of somewhere you could stay, if you chose to. I sat on the bed, looking at the chipped mug on the windowsill, and realized I'd crossed some invisible line. This wasn't just a stopover anymore. That night, I cooked my first meal since leaving. Instant noodles with a handful of vegetables from the corner store. The taste was nothing special, but the fact that I'd chosen it, bought it, and made it for myself felt like a victory. I ate by the window, watching the lights from the diner sign blink across the street. The warden in my head was still there, but quieter, as if even he couldn't argue with the smell of something cooking just for me. Before bed, I wrote a new line on my list. Live somewhere that feels like yours, even if it isn't forever.
On a Sunday morning, I surprised myself by walking toward a church. Not the one I'd grown up in. This was a brick building with white trim and a sign out front announcing a bake sale. The doors were propped open, and the sound of a piano floated out, warm and unpolished. I stood at the threshold for a long moment before stepping inside. The sanctuary smelled of coffee and old hymnals. People chatted in the aisles, their voices easy, without the sharp edge of watchfulness I remembered. I slipped into a back pew, telling myself I'd leave if it felt wrong. When the music started, I recognized the hymn, not the words, but the melody. My chest tightened, memories rising like a tide. I stayed through the first verse, but when the congregation's voices swelled, I felt the old collar tightening around my neck. Quietly, I stood and walked out. No one stopped me. No one even looked up. Outside, the air was bright and cool, and I realized I'd done something I never could have imagined back then. I'd left before the end simply because I wanted to. Walking back to my apartment, the click in my head was steady, almost in rhythm with my steps. I didn't feel triumphant, but I felt sure, and that was enough. That afternoon, I wrote another line on my list. You don't have to finish what hurts you. That night, I gave myself a kind of confession I'd never been allowed before. No witnesses, no audience, no one ready to measure my words against a book of rules. I sat at the small table by my window with only the chipped daisy mug for company.
I spoke out loud, not to anyone in particular, but to the room, to the air, to myself. I listed the things I'd never said in the community, that I'd been angry more often than I'd been grateful, that sometimes I'd prayed just to fill the silence, that I doubted almost everything but was too afraid to name it. My voice was unsteady at first, but it grew stronger the longer I spoke. There was no lightning strike, no sudden release, just a quiet settling inside me, like dust finding a place to land. When I finished, I sat in the stillness, feeling both emptied and heavy. I didn't write any of it down. The point wasn't to make a record. It was to let the words exist without being judged. For the first time, I understood that confession didn't have to be about forgiveness. Sometimes it was simply about telling the truth without flinching, even if no one else ever heard it. I rinsed out my mug, turned off the light, and went to bed without the usual tension in my shoulders. The warden in my head didn't speak that night. And in the quiet, I realized silence without lies feels different. A week later, I decided it was time to get rid of the paper I'd carried under my shoe for 2 years, the one with the phone number from the volunteer after the tornado. I'd never called it, but I'd kept it as a lifeline, proof that escape was possible if I was brave enough. Now it felt more like a tether, a reminder of the version of me who needed permission to leave. I found it in the bottom of my dresser drawer, the edges frayed, the ink faded almost to nothing. I made a small ritual of it. That evening, I walked to the alley behind my building with a lighter I'd bought at the corner store. The sun was setting, painting the brick walls in long shadows. I held the paper between my fingers for a moment, remembering how it had once felt like salvation. Then I struck the lighter. The flame curled the edges inward, the heat quick and deliberate. I watched it burn down to ash in my palm before letting the wind scatter it. There was no rush of liberation, no cinematic swell of music, just a clean, hollow space where the weight had been. On a walk back, I noticed the air felt cooler, sharper, as if the night itself had shifted. Back in my room, I added a new line to my list. You don't need a way out if you're not planning to leave. I set the list beside my bed and lay down, the smell of smoke still faint in my hair, and for the first time in years, I felt lighter without feeling afraid.
The change was quiet but unmistakable. I still went to work, still walked the track in the mornings, still bought small, unnecessary things at the corner store. But now there was a steadiness under it all, like a floor I could trust not to give way. The warden in my head wasn't gone, but his voice had lost its authority, reduced to background noise I could choose to ignore. One evening, sitting at my table with the window cracked open, I realized I hadn't thought about going back in weeks, not once. The absence of that thought felt like a gift I didn't know I'd been waiting for. I made tea in my chipped daisy mug and drank it slowly, watching the lights from the diner sign blink on and off across the street. Plain tea, no sugar, just the taste of something unadorned and mine. I thought about all the times I'd been told that happiness had to look a certain way, that peace had to be loud enough for others to applaud. But what I felt now was quiet, almost unremarkable, and yet it fit me perfectly. In the community, plainness was a rule meant to strip you down. Out here, plainness was a choice, and that made all the difference. I wrote one last line on my list. Plain is a flavor, too. Then I folded it carefully and slipped it back into my wallet, knowing I might never need to add to it again.
I don't know if there's such a thing as an ending. What I have now feels more like a rhythm. Days strung together by the sound of my own footsteps, the steady hum of the diner, the creak of the floor in my little apartment. I still catch myself flinching at certain voices, still feel the old collar tighten in moments I can't predict, but it loosens faster now. I know where the safe places are. The track at dawn, the booth by the window at work, the chair by my window at home with the chipped daisy mug in hand. I don't need to be fearless. I just need to keep choosing.
again and again, not to walk back through the open door. Sometimes I imagine my mother, somewhere far away, telling someone that I'm lost. And maybe to her I am, but I'm lost on my own terms now, charting a map that doesn't have to make sense to anyone else. There's no grand revelation waiting at the end of this road, no glittering skyline promising that all the hard parts are behind me, just the quiet knowledge that I've learned how to stay when I want to stay and to leave when I need to leave. Tonight, I'll wash my one mug, set it by the sink, and open the window to let the night air in. The street outside will be empty, the diner sign blinking its slow code into the dark. And I'll sit there, breathing, with the click in my head still steady, keeping time with my heartbeat.